its Camp Supply, the Washita Campaign, and the Cheyenne Captives. Now, the post-Civil War in western Kansas saw increased confrontation between the Southern Plains tribes, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Kiowa, and the Comanche, versus the ever-expanding influx of Anglo-Americans into the region, whether they were in the settlements in northern Kansas or along the trails that went west from eastern Kansas to, say, Denver, Colorado, along the Solomon and Saline rivers. Because of depredations in the settlements, in the spring and the summer of 1868, General Philip Sheridan, who ran the army in this part of the world, ordered Colonel Alfred Sully, 3rd U.S. Infantry, to lead a punitive expedition south of Fort Dodge, which is just 90 miles to the north and west of what's now Fort Supply, to punish those deemed responsible, or at least push the tribes south of the Arkansas River. And the Arkansas River was just a stone's throw from Fort Dodge. The Indian Territory Expedition, it was called, left Fort Dodge on the evening of September the 7th, 1868. The expedition consisted of 9 companies of the 7th Cavalry, commanded by Major Joel Elliott, and Captain John Page's company of the 3rd Infantry that provided escort for the supply train. The march went southwest from Fort Dodge on to the Cimarron River, then down to the Beaver River. After crossing the Cimarron, the expedition, as it marched along, encountered daily running fights with increasing numbers of Indians as they marched in a southeasterly direction. On September the 13th, the force fought among the sand hills along the south side of Wolf Creek, near the confluence of the Beaver River and Wolf Creek. Camp that night was on or near the location on the floodplain that's created by the confluence and the Beaver River. Sully would later choose, although he attributed the idea of camping there to several people, but we're going to say it was Sully, would later choose this location for a forward supply base that would become known as Camp Supply. With the return of the expedition to Kansas, a lull occurred in the fall of 1868. While Sheridan's winter campaign plan was hatched to punish the tribes in better than they had failed to accomplish, I suppose, in September. The plan was for a winter campaign to use the season to the advantage of the Army and the disadvantage of the Indians. It was a multi-pronged offensive into western Indian Territory, western Oklahoma, from Camp Supply, Fort Bascom, New Mexico, and Fort Lyon, Colorado. The offensive began in mid-November. Camp of Supply, as it was originally called, was established November the 18th, 1868. The original stockade at Camp Supply was completed in November of 1868, late November. It was located on a sandy part of the floodplain there, about a half-mile northeast of where the present replica, constructed in 1995, is located. Custer was slowed in his progress to begin the offensive in order to lend his soldiers to the defense construction of the post, aka they had to build a stockade before the infantry would let them leave. Because you have to remember that this particular part of Indian Territory was pretty dangerous at that particular time. There were 2 15-foot high blockhouses at the northwest and southeast corners. 2 70-foot long storehouses were built in the south and east walls. They just actually formed part of the wall. The stockade was used as a supply depot and a defensive position. Infantry soldiers lived in tents outside, and 2 half-dug-out lunettes, which is just a chevron-shaped building at the corners that were not covered by the blockhouses. Now, there was a correspondent. There were a lot of war correspondents from the Civil War that were still looking for something to do. So he says, one of the most defensible works of its kind on the plains. You remember his readership is heavily in the eastern part of the United States. not the soldiers that were living in the tents and huts. The storehouses and quarters of the soldiers are constructed of heavy timber and are loopholed for musketry. The stockade is 10 feet high. The blockhouses are 10 feet in height, with a parapet of 4 feet. The soldiers' quarters are so constructed that they can fire over the roofs of the buildings, that's the lunettes, at the angles, while an additional fire is delivered from the loopholes inside. Personally, I'd rather have been inside at a loophole than outside standing on the building. Some quarters for soldiers were described as comfortable, as could be had at any temporary post. And mainly these are what we would call dugouts. They were pits 4.5 feet deep, walled with cottonwood logs, extending above the ground about 3 feet and covered with logs, straw, and earth. Which means when it rained, you got wet if you were inside or outside. And the camp of the 7th Cavalry was located along the Beaver River just to the north of the post. If you desire any further information on Custer's march to and from the Washita, you will have to refer to the Chronicles of Oklahoma, which is published by the Oklahoma Historical Society. I wrote the narrative for that and furnished the maps. I must have been right, nobody's complained yet. Black Kettle's village, if you've been out to the site, was located on the south side of the Washita River, scattered in the brush and timber along the bank for about 1/4 mile. There were some 50 lodges. That's debatable. Black Kettle's band had been greatly diminished by the 1864 massacre at Sand Creek in southeast Colorado. They had never really fully recovered, and this was noted by one of the captains, Captain Barnett, in the 7th Cavalry, in his notebook year previous. When he was detailing, he was noting Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs and the size of their bands and so forth and so on. His was just, it's like there's hardly anybody left of this band after Sand Creek. Most of the villagers were women and children and the elderly, and there was no night guard, so because who's going to attack you in the middle of the winter? Hadn't happened to them before. The warriors in the village put up a resistance the best they could. This is probably one of the newest renditions, artwork that's been done to describe the actual event. And of course, in the foreground here, probably done just so this talk would seem more accurate. There is a woman and a child that's trying to escape. And we will see later on, there's another image of that was done at contemporary to the battle. I have a problem with both images, in old and new, in that the lodges seem to be awfully close together. But that's artistic license. And I speak with a degree of accuracy since I am an artist also. And you can see, let's see if this works. There's probably Custer. There's an image that floats around that was taken at Fort Sill later in the late spring. Custer in his buckskins and his fur cap. Now, we really don't have, I haven't seen anything that told me what he was wearing that day. And this, I assume, is Ben Clark, his chief of scouts. This is another image, as you can see in the foreground. Seems to be consistent with artistic renderings. The woman and the children are fleeing. The lodges are all too close together. Missed my pointer. Here's Custer, again with fur cap. They must have attacked in a column because there's a long line of people. I assume this has to be Captain Hamilton. who was killed in the opening attack. Now, the Custer had been with the Hancock expedition in Kansas when they come upon a large Cheyenne encampment. So they arrayed in, it's the normal Civil War battle, order of battle, and gave an ultimatum, you know, y'all surrender, we're gonna be there in the morning. And the big camp was over here, and everybody went to bed. When they got up the next morning, all the Indians had left. So, with that in mind, Custer says, this time, when we attack the village, we're going to come in from different directions in encirclement, which worked to a certain degree. During the attack, as you can see, women and children were caught in the crossfire. Some were inevitably killed while fleeing in the chaos. And we'll go back one. Okay, most attempted to flee either downstream toward the large villages of Kiowa, Arapahoe, and Cheyenne, on around the bend toward Strong City. Custer didn't know that until later. Some took cover under the embankment along the Washita. Most of those did not survive. Now, Custer, as his trailers, so to speak, or what we would call probably an Indian scout, were Osages. Osages and Cheyenne, I don't think they get along to this day. They were real enemies even before the Washita. So the Osages came into the attack, and they were indiscriminate about who they killed, but whoever they came to first, men or women. Before they were stopped, a good many of these non-combatants were escaped by hiding, or like I said, fleeing downriver toward the other villages. The most notable account that I've run across of the women and children that we call the Cheyenne captives or prisoners begins with a group that were fleeing straight south of the village toward the two knolls that you see if you'd been out to the site. And Custer was on Custer's Knoll, or whatever they call it today, but with his chief of scouts, Ben Clark, and Clark saw that the people that were fleeing across the open area were running into Captain Myers' battalion coming in from that direction, and they were being fired on. Let's pause for calls here. He brought this to Custer's attention and asked if killing them was what Custer wanted. Depending on whose version of his reply you believe, he said no. And some say he said no, maybe not. He told Clark to ride over and find the officer in charge, give him my compliments, this is the Victorian Area Army, and tell him to stop. Which Clark did, and he took them into the village and had them placed under guard in several of the larger lodges that were down in the main camp. So one of the things I like about Clark is he winds up, you never hear of him actually shooting an Indian, Cheyenne, Arapahoe, Kiowa, but he's always trying to help them out in this particular time while he's saving Cheyenne lives. These were probably not all of the women taken prisoner. Clark said he counted up about 60 people. And of course the count is now at 53. So, and there were other women that were brought in from other directions. Several of these women had been coerced into helping soldiers and some of the other scouts gather the large pony herds that belonged to the Black Kettle Band that were out grazing. Brought them back into the campsite. There was one of the scouts, white scouts, was a mixed blood. He was he spoke I think he lived with the Arapaho, so he spoke Cheyenne Arapaho. He could speak the sign language. His name was Romero. He had he was sent down to talk to the captives in the lodge, reassure them that they would not be killed, and to confirm the story that they were telling him, or he had heard that there were other large villages downstream. There was a officer, a newly minted West Pointer, name of Edward Godfrey, who was ordered by Custer to destroy everything in the village. And he allowed women to go back to their own lodges and get their personal belongings needed for the ride back to Supply. Godfrey and his company were detailed to guard the captives, although I've heard several officers say that they were detailed to guard the captives. So apparently they were some errors made in judgment or recollections, I suppose. With the fighting at an impasse in the village area, Custer had scouts and troopers, with the help of the women, go find the horses, and he also put the women in an advantageous place within the middle of the encampment, so that the warriors that had begun to assemble on the hills around them would hopefully not fire into the village. Of course, the horses and mules that they had rounded up were placed against the terrace out here on the southeast of the village, and horses and mules were doled out to the scouts. The Osages took a bunch. They had horses that were disabled pulling the ammunition wagons in. They had mules. They placed them in harness also. And then the captives were allowed to catch horses because they needed to ride back to Camp Supply and not walk. If they walked, that would slow the whole process down. And by this time, Custer knew he was facing a lot of Indians. Seems like this happens to him again later on in life, and he doesn't learn very well. And then they started shooting the horses, what was left. Here we go. This is an image done by a contemporary war correspondent / artist, Theodore Davis, for a period publication, showing again a little artistic license. I might say, though, that at that particular time, the artist would draw the image out here on site, and he would send it back to, say, Harper's Weekly. And there, the editor might change it. The people who were doing the engraving might change it. As you'll notice, in this particular image, there's a travois here, which was probably carrying wounded people, Indians. It's on either side is an armed guard. Seemed to cut my image off a little bit. And you see people, you know, here's a woman and a child. Here are the captives behind here, and they're all walking. So apparently it must have been too hard to draw all the people on the horses, so they just do people. And the soldiers in the background. And from what I've noticed about some of the narratives that I've read over the years is that on the way to the Ouachita, they were in a fierce snowstorm the first day. After that, not so much. But looks to me like there's a raging blizzard and going on in this image too. Now Davis is another indication of artistic license. He had been assigned to the campaign, but had stayed with Sheridan in Supply, so he didn't even see this. He only heard what the officers told him upon their return. Now there were soldiers who of course guarded them to keep them from wandering off or escaping. But apparently they weren't real worried about this happening because one account by, again, Lieutenant Godfrey gives the impression they weren't closely guarded. One of the women came to Godfrey and asked if she could leave the column briefly, and he agreed. Well, what was going through his mind? Well, a short time later, she came back riding to the column with a baby that she'd just given birth to. Some warriors followed the column in an attempt to rescue all or part of the prisoners, but they were just too well guarded. Custers sent word to Sheridan from his last camp on Wolf Creek that he and the command would be returning to Camp Supply and would pass in review for Sheridan. Reminds you of the old triumphal entries of the Roman generals in the Rome. Probably not as colorful though. He planned a triumphal entrance that may have set the tone for many of those Wild West shows that we see later on with Cody and Pawnee Bill. So on December the 1st, the command crested the ridge south of Camp Supply, and you have to imagine that there's this long ridge that slopes down toward Wolf Creek. So you can see people coming in for quite a way because there were really no trees except down around the river. And so Custer draws up the command. He marches down the slope. The Osage Scouts led the procession. They were singing their war songs and firing guns, celebrating their part in the great victory against their old foes, the Cheyenne. Next in line were the white scouts, followed by prisoners, all of the captives. Another war correspondent, apparently they liked to stay with Sheridan instead of going out in the field, wrote that the women mounted on horses, wrapped in skins and blankets, their head and face covered, leaving nothing but their eyes, their papoose on their back, and their children mounted behind them, as many as 3 mounted on some of the ponies. Without a sigh, without a glance to the right or left, the remnants of the band of the once powerful Black Kettle followed with all the submission of captors. Again, a little, writing for that readership back east. The band played Gary Owen, the regiment's favorite march. Then came Cook's sharpshooters and the 7th Cavalry and column of platoons, and of course the supply wagons. The Cheyenne captives were held briefly at Supply, though I have not found information regarding to exactly how long or where they were kept. My guess is that they were probably put under guard in several of the large hospital tents, or maybe even held within the stockade, which is not probably a very good idea since that's where most of the supplies were. I might add that stockade was built in order to have a place where you would have a last defense position. Plus, it was also had guards on it all the time, so they stored all the good supplies in there. Never trust the soldiers around the supplies. Some of these prisoners had been wounded in the fighting. Of course, at this point, they probably all expected to be killed, as would have probably happened if it had been your Indian enemies. But again, they would have these fears allayed by interpreters several times. Army doctors at the makeshift post hospital, which was actually just large hospital tents put together, attended the wounded. Keim described the toughness of those who were probed for metal, who had their wounds cleansed all the while enduring without a sound. One little girl with a bullet hole through her body on the left side sat up as if in perfect health. Keim also wrote that the captives, sick and well, have not lost appetite or flesh since in our hands. Their capacity for stowing away food is truly amazing. Hardtack to them is a great luxury, and old and young, sick and well, devour it with all the relish of the choicest and richest cake. Now, I know he's telling a story there because hardtack is a large, hard cracker. And I've heard that you have to actually boil it in coffee, in other words, to get it to where you could eat it without it breaking teeth. And they were probably still using Civil War hardtack, which was only, what, 3 years old. Hardtack would be a luxury if you were starving. Let's see. Okay. Not exactly where I was going with that, but remind me to back up. Here's another interesting image. This has always been known as an image taken by William S. Sewell, one of the early photographers who happened to work for an Indian trader, a post trader. The captives. And you'll notice some are wearing black hides. This is an army blanket. You can tell by that dark stripe. And this was supposed to have been taken before they went to Fort Dodge and Fort Hays. But the problem I have with that is these trees have leaves on them. And there's some grass, you know what I mean? So, my guess is that this is an image from when they came back from Fort Hays in the spring of 1869. So it's probably taken upon their release. And the person up, man, the other thing that bothers me is this looks like a man to me. So he may have come down to collect relatives. If you've never heard of William S. Sewell, you could Google him and find out that he took a lot of the early images of the Southern Plains tribes. Very good photographer. So Sheridan decided to send these people to Fort Hays, as it was a good distance from the field of operations, and that were about to commence, and that they could be well guarded and sheltered. Camp Supply continued to be a resupply point for the next part of the campaign. For the winter and spring of 1869, for the 7th Cavalry and the 19th Kansas Volunteers. Custer was allowed to take 3 of the women with the command when the field operations began again in mid-December. They were to act as peace emissaries and interpreters. One of these was the daughter of Little Rock. She was known as Miotzi, or what we call her Montecita. Now, I don't know how much use she was as an interpreter, because she had to learn her English in a very short time. On December the 8th, the remaining prisoners were transported by an empty supply train by Quartermaster Captain Henry Inman to Fort Dodge. Inman provided extra blankets and rations. Again, we see, I think this is probably, I don't know why they couldn't have got everybody for a group shot, but I think I counted 36 people in this image. Plus the scout and interpreter at Fort Dodge was a man named John Austin. You'll see some of them in the gray infantry blankets. Some of these are probably the dark blue wool cavalry horse blankets for the younger set. This is sometimes labeled as Fort Supply, but it's not, because at that particular time they had no standing structures like that. It was mostly just dugouts and tents. A letter to Indian Agent Colonel Wynkoop at Fort Dodge, sent by scout and interpreter James S. Morrison, stated that 53 people had arrived at Fort Dodge on a military supply train on December the 14th, 1868. It's about 90 miles, or about 14 days after arriving at Camp Supply. The early road to Dodge was over 100 miles, and it was 75 miles from Dodge to Hays. When they got to Hays, the soldiers placed the prisoners in a log stockade that they had built just for the occasion. It was called the Indian Pen. There was a walled enclosure that had a parapet all the way around that the guard walked the entire perimeter around it. Inside, the prisoners lived in conical Sibley tents, which is just a large multi-soldier tent at the time. Here's another Sewell image taken at Camp Supply of the 3 sub-chiefs taken as prisoners by Custers when he went on his next campaign through Western Indian Territory and the Texas Panhandle. Later on in the spring, they were sent to Fort Hays. Unfortunately, I've seen the photograph, the people in the photograph listed with several different names, so I'm not real sure who to give the correct name to. You can see here that this man packed his bucket and whatever other needs he had to have. Here's a buffalo robe. Here's a peace medal. Be nice to have one of those today. And this is an old pre-Civil War Hardee hat that he is almost worn out. It's got an infantry badge emblem on it. They were, for this purpose, one was called Fat Bear, the other was Dull Knife, and the other was Big Head. That might be Fat Bear. Seems to have wintered quite well. The 3 Cheyenne men were delivered to the Fort Hays stockade on May 9th, 1869, though. The commanding officer decided to take them out of the Indian pen and put them in a more secure facility, the Army Guardhouse. Nobody bothered to interpret for these people the reasons they were being taken out of the stockade. And they rightfully assumed that they were to be taken out and executed. So they rushed the guards with knives they had hidden, and 2 of them were killed. I think the first 2. I saw a piece of correspondence that said May 1st, prisoners were issued 58 sets of drawers, which is long handles, flannel shirts, blankets, flannel sack coats, which is the government issue soldier coat, and 11 pair of trousers. 58 sets of drawers and only 11 pair of trousers. And we're talking about, all but 2 are women. I mean, 2 are men. Negotiations between the Cheyenne Indian agents and the Army in the late spring made it possible to return the prisoners to their people. The young Arapaho boy, the only Arapaho that was taken in I think would have been classified as the oldest male at the time, was escorted back to Supply on June the 4th to be released into the custody of Arapaho Chief Little Raven. The captives moved south to Camp Supply, escorted by a company of the 7th Cavalry on June 13, 69, having spent 7 months in detention. The captives arrived at Camp Supply 10 days later, on June 22nd. This is an image, a modern image that was painted of the stockade here, the soldier on guard. This is when they were releasing the captives back to go back south to their families. This is supposed to be Montecito, and you can see that I assume this is Custer and his wife. Again, I think it's probably some artistic license going on there. Okay, Camp Supply was reinforced with soldiers of the 10th Cavalry during this period. This is one of the Buffalo Soldier units. And the construction of a larger post to accommodate them was begun. And of course, back then, everything was built by labor of the troops. They didn't hire too many outside contractors. Camp Supply would also become the Cheyenne Arapaho Agency in 1869. An Army officer, who was a commissary officer, named Bonney, was detailed to construct storehouses for the Indians' annuity goods that they would get, food and clothing, things like that, for their when they signed the treaties back in 1867. So they built these 2 nice storehouses, and you can see there are people lined along the wall here, and the horses getting ready to load their supplies to take them back to camp. They had a little problem with them coming into Camp Supply. Sometimes they had to haul the supplies out from 3 to 7 miles for any distribution. I might note that when the Cheyenne Rifle Agency was moved to where it's at now, they deconstructed those buildings and took them and hauled them all down there. And I have no idea where the buildings were placed. Nobody ever put them on a map. So I assume they were not close to the post itself. Brenton Darlington was the Quaker agent. He arrived at Camp Supply in early 1869. He was unhappy with the location for the agency because there were too many soldiers there. He deemed that soldiers, being a Quaker, he deemed soldiers were a bad influence, plus the fact that around Camp Supply, the land was not that great for farming. However, most of the Cheyenne were opposed to the move, and only a few went. He would eventually convince most of them to come in a year or two. Here's an image that Sewell took of ration day near Camp Supply. And everybody has got their horses and travois and lots of dogs. Out here in the middle, here's all your annuity goods, and they would call out the head men of each band, family group, and they would come and pick up their supplies. And then it would be dispersed by them into their particular group. In the middle, these are some of the officers' wives who had come out to see this spectacle. May 3rd, 1870, they began to move down to what we call the Darlington Agency, which is across the river, the Canadian, from what would later be built Fort Reno, just northwest of what we call El Reno. They started, the Camp Supply for a number of years was built of log structures. As you can see, there's one back there. This image, it may be a Sewell, I'm not real sure who it is. These are some of the infantry officers who were posted at Camp Supply. And down here is one of their hounds, I guess, although he looks more like a dachshund at that particular angle. And here's 2 pieces of artillery. These are little 12-pound mountain howitzers. This is not an officer. He is an Englishman who has journeyed west to see what's going on. This is Captain John Page. You heard me mention him earlier. He was the first commander of the CO at the post at Camp Supply. This is the officer of the day that day. You can tell by the sash and the sword. I don't think Page was all that small. I just think this man's name was William W. Williams. And could have played basketball. His height. In the early 1870s, the tribes were attempting to remain on their reservations, or we were trying to keep them there. Cavalry at Camp Supply patrolled the region, while the infantry kept the post open and escorted supply trains. On June 11th, 1870, the post was attacked by warriors attempting to steal the horses and mules grazing west of the post, probably around where the town of Supply is now. This fight became known as the Battle of Camp Supply. It was the only time that they actually had a battle at the fort, or near the fort. It was a running engagement out west of Supply, up and down either Wolf Creek or the Beaver River. A lot of ammunition expended with few casualties. Camp Supply was also the supply point for the troops for Sheridan's campaign that they called the Red River Wars from late 1874 to the spring of 1875. So once again, you see Supply is living up to its name. And this was the final real struggle for the subjugation of the Southern Plains tribes. Camp Supply's cavalry also participated in the unsuccessful attempt to stop the flight of a band of Northern Cheyenne who had been brought down from Montana the year before and placed on the reservation at Fort Reno. And they decided they didn't want to be here, so they were going to go home, but they didn't stop to get permission. So therefore you have this long running fight. There were 3 of them all the way until they got captured up in Nebraska in the fall of 1878. Camp Supply acquired a new name in January of 1879 with its designation as Fort Supply. It was one of the few Army posts in the West after the Civil War that was not named after a dead Yankee general. Sheridan intended to name all the posts after his friends that did not survive. And then the post leads a relatively quiet life during its last 15 years, serving to maintain the peace in the western Cherokee Outlet. You have to remember that up there, that part of the world still belonged to the Cherokee at the time. They didn't want to live there, but it still belonged to them. The post acted as a buffer between the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation and the citizens of Kansas. The folks in Kansas were always a little leery since the Northern Cheyennes had crossed western Kansas in 1878 on their way home. The newspapers in western Kansas made a pretty good killing, so to speak, subscription-wise, after that every spring with rumors of a great Indian outbreak. Troops also escorted the cattle drives along the western or Texas Trail that skirted around the post to the west, about where May is in that area. So the military reservation had a fence around it to keep people out of it, so that they would have grazing and be able to cut wood and things like that. The troops also helped to hold the people in Kansas and Texas back whenever they opened the Cherokee Outlet for settlement in September of 1893. Now by the time 94 rolls around, Washington's talking about closing military posts. Now they call them base closures. Well, back then they had a whole bunch of them. So Supply closed in late 1894. The reason that they were doing this was because the West was finally settled, peaceful, so to speak, and they could concentrate troops at large posts like Fort Leavenworth, Fort Riley, and if you had a problem out west, it was cheaper to put the troops on the trains that had by now crisscrossed the nation than send them there instead of keeping these posts open. It cost money to keep them open. Okay, from 1894 to 1906, the abandoned post buildings were used by squatters or settlers who came in and lived in the old post buildings or stole things out of the doors, bathtubs, things like that seemed to disappear. Once a year, the federal marshal from Kansas would roam through the area and arrest a few people and take them back to Kansas for trial, and they'd be acquitted and he'd turn them loose and they'd come back to Supply. Now in 1908, by 1908, the state, in 1907, had refurbished all the post buildings to open it up as the state's first state-run mental institution. And the first patients arrived in May of 1908. It is still in operation today, although downsized. It's now called the Northwest Center for Behavioral Health. It was the Oklahoma Hospital for the Insane. So, for political correctness. In 1989, because they weren't using all their buildings, the state of Oklahoma opened William Key Correctional Center, which was it's a minimum security prison. In 1992, the Oklahoma Historical Society opened the Fort Supply Historic Site. It's the only site that I've ever found that a historic site that borders with a correctional institution. I tell people it's contiguous, but actually it's surrounded. It's just contiguous on 4 sides. The Fort Supply Historic Site today is dedicated to the preservation, restoration, and interpretation of the Indian Wars period through its original military buildings and the reproduction of the stockade. Oh, there we go. This is the Ordnance Sergeant's cabin, or quarters, I should say. It was built in 1875. It's a picket log structure. The logs go up and down. Whole post up until the late 1870s was built like this. The reason is, from what I've read, is one, they're easy to construct. If some soldiers shovels, they go out and dig trenches after you lay out your outline of your 3 rooms or whatever. And the other soldiers are out cutting cedar trees or cottonwood trees. They found out cottonwood trees don't last very long. Cut down the cedar trees, bring them in, just place them in the ground, backfill them, put a top plate on, put a roof on, you're good to go. If you ever needed to add on, you just take a couple of logs out, put a door in. This, as far as I know, is the oldest standing structure in northwest Oklahoma. It's embedded in the hospital area, though, so it's not actually in the historic site area. The Ordnance Sergeant was a non-commissioned officer who was a permanent duty person at a post. You applied for the job, and then you got sent someplace, and you could stay there. He was in charge of all the weapons and ammunition, saddles, things like that. If I got all these, that's what it looks like today. And as you can see, the hospital staff used to live in the building, so they added on a kitchen. On the other side, is indoor plumbing. But this is basically the image that's the main house, or the original house. Okay, this is the quartermaster's civilian employee quarters. And again, it's one of the examples of a once common but now rare construction form. This one is over in the historic side. It's been taken better care of. We were up. You gotta be careful where you put your finger. The new mortar in here. And this around the bottom is the concrete. The hospital, without any guidance from historic preservationists, at one time, because hospital personnel lived in the building, they poured cement in for the flooring and encased the logs. You dig down the outside and the cedar's gone under the cement. It just rotted off. And what I normally tell people was that this building, that is being held up actually by the termite locking arms. The civilian employees' quarters, there were several buildings like this. This is just the smaller of the only one left. The quartermaster corrals were behind this building, and sitting next to it were 2 larger buildings. One was a Teamster's mess and one was a Teamster's dormitory. That's why it got the name early on of the Teamster's quarters, because that's the guys that drove the wagons, the contractors. I mean, the employees of the quartermaster corps that were civilians. Now, we also think that it was the home of the post interpreter and scout, a fellow named Amos Chapman. Now, Amos was one of only 4 civilians to ever been awarded the Medal of Honor. He lost his leg at the Battle of the Buffalo Wallow out in 1874 during this battle, and then he and Billy Dixon were the only 2 civilians with the scout messengers out there. I mean, soldier messengers. So they were given these medals. And then along comes the government about World War I, and they rescind all of those medals. Well, fortunately, one of the other people who received the medal had a big fan club. His name was William F. Cody. So the government, due to pressure from outside sources, gave all the medals back. He and his family would have lived in this building. It's actually just 2 rooms. He married a Cheyenne woman, daughter of a chief, had a whole passel of kids. And then when the post closed, he moved to Sealing, Oklahoma, where I think that's where her allotment was. This is the commanding officer's quarters. It was built in 1878. This is where the commanding officer lived. It's the nicest building on the place. It was probably one of the first frame buildings built. And during the early hospital period, there was a superintendent of the hospital who went around and named the buildings that were left after historical figures. He named this the Custer House. And we still had people come up and want to see where Custer lived. And I said he lived in a tent down on the Beaver River. And then, you know, they're kind of heartbroken, but I know from records that the house was built in 1878 and he died in 1876. But when we were working on the interior of the house, we pulled some of that cheap state paneling off the walls because it had also been lived in. It was made into a duplex for hospital employees. Somebody had written, Custer slept here. So if your name is George and you slept about every place like George Washington or George Custer, then you know you're going to be famous. And of course, here is there's a walkway. This is in the squatter period, but here's your picket fence. The building was actually a maroon reddish color. And the whole post in the early years, they went around twice a year and they painted all those logs red to keep down the bugs. That's what they said. I don't know. If you see an image of Officers Row, you can see several different colors, different shades of black and white, which means there's different colors. Victorians didn't paint everything white. They liked a main body color, which was colorful, and 2 trim colors. And then along comes the hospital. If it didn't move, they painted white, hospital white. And of course the porch has been added on here. This is the main entrance. This side was the family area. This side was the formal area, which had a little anteroom off to the side. I guess instead of knocking at the front door, you came in there if you needed to see the commanding officer. There's a large hall here. I was told that they also held dances in that hall, but that sounds a little crowded to me. It was a nice house. Of course, when the hospital got it, that's where they put the superintendent because it was a nice house. Moving along, this is a period image of a officer's quarters. It's a double set, or what we call a duplex. You'll notice the door here, and a little fence separating your families. Here's a boardwalk, goes down the front there, and of course a post rail in the yard. It has a side yard here. It's a story and a half, what we also call a 2-story house. This particular one was blue. The individuals here, one of them was detailed as the commander of the Indian Scouts that were there for a while. We actually dug down to see if we could find any remnants of the boardwalk at one place in front of the house. We did. And also amongst the rotten planks there, about yay far down, this is what happens when you don't mow in when you mow in western Oklahoma, you don't pick up, it gets deep. Soil just fills in. We found friction primers, which are the little things that go in the end of the tube in the cannon you pull and fires down and shoots off the. I had been on several battlefield archaeological surveys and not found any of those. And I found 3 in front of this house. So probably what happened when they fired a salute gun twice a day, kids went out and got friction primers and they played with them and dropped them. This is what it looks like today. We did paint analysis to make sure we painted everything the right color. And this is the guardhouse. This was the centerpiece of the historic site. It has a metal roof. It had 6 stove flues, vented with three chimneys. It's full course, 3 courses of masonry. It's a solid brick building. The bars are original to the building. Right here is a piece of slate that goes all the way around the building. It's a water barrier. It keeps the water table's kind of low right there, between the two rivers, and it keeps water from wicking up and destroying all the brick. Below this, the face has popped off the brick from heat and cold water. Above that, it's in great shape, except where it bows right here for some reason. We had to somebody put a porch on it before I got there because the building had been used by the hospital as a commissary warehouse. Keep the food in there because it's got the bars on it, keep patients out of the food. So everything came out of this front door, using the porch as a loading dock, so it was pretty much shot. It had a wooden shingle roof on it when I got it. We found the original shingle type and color down, I think in Houston someplace. And there wasn't a single of the original shingles that we could find until the last day they were taking the roof off, and I'd already ordered the new metal shingles. Sure enough, same thing. That's great. I took a chance and it worked. And we have restored the interior of the building, and apparently that wasn't on there, and furnished it as to what the guardhouse would look like at that particular time. It was built in 1893, so really it wasn't in use by the Army but about 2 years or later. 1892, I'm sorry.